It's confirmed. Something fundamental has shifted in the global monetary system, and most people have no idea it just happened. While the world slept, decisions were set in motion that will redefine how money works, how savings are valued, and what wealth actually means going forward. For more than 5 decades, the global economy operated on an assumption, an agreement everyone accepted without question. But this morning, cracks in that assumption became impossible to ignore. Major economies quietly initiated transactions built not on trust or promises, but on hard assets, metal, not paper. This didn't arrive with a press conference or a breaking news alert. It never does. These moments surface quietly through settlement mechanisms, balance sheets, and movements most people won't understand until the consequences reach their bank accounts. The math behind this shift is unforgiving. The timeline is accelerating, and what follows will not look like anything you've lived through before. If you've been around long enough to remember recessions, crashes, and recoveries, understand this. Those were cycles inside the same system. What's unfolding now is a change to the system itself, and that distinction matters. Before we go any further, let me say this clearly. Information like this doesn't come from headlines or television panels. It comes from patterns, from accumulation, from what central banks do quietly while telling the public something very different. If you want to stay ahead of changes like this, make sure you're paying attention here. Not out of habit, but because awareness is the only real advantage individuals ever get. And let me know where you're watching from. The United States, Europe, Asia, somewhere else. Because this shift isn't local, it's global. Now let's step back and look at how we got here. For 55 years, the modern financial system ran on borrowed time. In 1971, when Richard Nixon stood before the cameras and suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, it was described as temporary, a short-term fix, a pause. But temporary quietly became permanent. That moment marked the beginning of the fiat currency era. Money backed by nothing but confidence. No metal, no constraint. Just faith in governments to manage debt responsibly. For decades, that faith held. People believed, nations believed, central banks appeared to believe, or at least they wanted the public to think they did, because while attention was focused elsewhere, something else was happening beneath the surface. The world's creditors were watching the numbers grow. U.S. debt climbed past levels that could never be repaid in real terms. The calculations were simple. There was no realistic path to settlement without dilution. China saw it, Russia saw it, Saudi Arabia saw it, and quietly, methodically, without announcements or speeches, preparation began. Central banks started buying gold, not symbolically, not occasionally, but at record levels, year after year. The same institutions that once dismissed gold as obsolete were accumulating it faster than at any point in modern history. That contradiction tells you everything you need to know. They knew something the public didn't know. They were front-running the collapse of their own system. And then this morning happened. A trade settlement between Shanghai and Dubai, not in dollars, not in euros, not in yen, in gold, physical, tangible, undeniable gold. The first official transaction of a new monetary system. A system not based on debt, but based on assets not backed by promises, but backed by metal. The petrodollar era had ended. The petrol era had begun, and with it came mathematical certainty. The unbacked US dollar was finished. History. He had shown this pattern before. The Roman denarius collapsed, the French assignat worthless, the Weimar mark used as wallpaper. Every fiat currency in history had returned to its intrinsic value, zero, and the US dollar was now following the same path, the same inevitable, unavoidable path. The central bankers knew this. That's why they had been preparing. That's why the gold buying had accelerated. That's why Russia and China had been dumping US Treasury bonds. They saw the ending before anyone else did. The mechanics of this new system were simple, revolutionary, but simple. Instead of trusting a central bank to manage money supply, the money supply would be limited. Limited by physical gold in vaults, this imposed discipline. Governments couldn't just print gold. They couldn't create it from thin air. They had to live within their means. For politicians in Washington, this was a nightmare. No more endless printing, no more funding wars with fake money, no more kicking the can down the road. But for savers, for workers, for honest people, this was liberation. It meant savings couldn't be inflated away. It meant the money earned today would hold its value tomorrow. Sound money was the foundation of a free society, and freedom had just made a comeback. The question now wasn't if this would affect everyone. The question was how soon, and the answer was terrifying. There was a man in Texas, a simple rancher who kept his life savings in a bank account, $250,000, 40 years of hard work, blood, sweat, and cattle sales. He thought he was safe. He thought his money was secure. But he had no idea that his $250,000 was about to become worthless paper because something was happening in the gold markets, something that would rewrite the value of everything. The spot price on the COMEX, the official gold exchange, it showed gold at around $2,700 per ounce, a number that financial analysts debated, a number that seemed stable, a number that was completely irrelevant because the real price of gold wasn't being set in New York anymore. It was being set in Shanghai and Dubai and Moscow, in the actual trade settlements between actual countries with actual physical gold. And those settlements were revealing a terrifying truth. Saudi Arabia had just declared 1 barrel of oil equals 1 gram of gold. Let that sink in. 1 barrel, 1 gram. The math was brutal. If a barrel of oil costs 1 gram of gold and oil needs to remain at certain dollar prices for economies to function, then the dollar price of gold had to rise dramatically, violently, inevitably. Financial experts were now predicting a repricing of gold at $10,000 per ounce. Some whispered $20,000. The most aggressive analysts suggested even higher. But here's what most people didn't understand. The dollar price of gold wasn't going up. The value of the dollar said that it was going down to meet the reality of the metal. That Texas rancher's $250,000 in a world where gold hits $20,000 per ounce would buy him what? A fraction of what it buys today. His life's work evaporating, not because he did anything wrong, but because the money itself was dying. And he wasn't alone. Millions of retirees sitting on pensions invested in government bonds that promised future dollar payments. But if the dollar was collapsing, those promises were worthless. Your retirement account sitting in mutual funds, in stocks, in bonds, in dollar-denominated assets, all of it was in the crosshairs because the shift to a gold-backed system wipes out paper assets completely, mercilessly, mathematically. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they had created the catalyst, a gold-backed currency alternative, a viable escape from the dollar system. And now countries faced a simple choice. Hold U.S. debt that yields negative real returns or hold gold-backed bonds with actual value? The answer was obvious. Capital was already fleeing. From west to east, from New York to Shanghai, the economic center of gravity was shifting. The West had financial engineering, derivatives, credit default swaps, complex instruments. The East had physical gold. And in a reset, he who has the gold makes the rules. But it wasn't just gold. There was another metal waiting in the shadows. Silver. Throughout history, silver had been the people's money. While kings hoarded gold, the common man used silver for wages, for groceries, for daily transactions, and as gold became too valuable for small purchases, silver would return to its ancient role. The gold-to-silver ratio currently sat at 80-1, meaning 80 ounces of silver bought 1 oz of gold. But historically, and that ratio was 15-1, sometimes even 10-1. If the ratio crashed back to historical norms, silver had more upside potential than gold itself. Silver was the high-octane fuel of this monetary revolution. And almost nobody was paying attention. Meanwhile, governments were preparing their response. They saw what was coming. They knew the people would panic. They knew citizens would rush to buy gold and silver. So they were preparing to ban it. They would call it hoarding. They would call it unpatriotic. They would launch their central bank digital currency, the CBDC, a digital token tracked, traced, and controlled. And they would try to force people to use it. But a digital token backed by nothing was still fiat currency, just faster, just more surveilled, just another way to go broke. The public was waking up. They preferred the weight of metal in their hand over pixels on a screen, over promises from politicians, over digital slavery. The black market for gold and silver would become the free market operating outside government control, beyond their reach, in the shadows where freedom survives. And the banking system, the mighty too-big-to-fail banking system, was about to face its fatal moment because modern banking relied on fractional reserves lending out money they didn't actually have, but under a gold standard, banks needed 100% reserves. Real gold, real backing, real accountability. The era of easy credit was ending. The era of bailouts was over. The too-big-to-fail banks were actually insolvent, and a wave of bank failures was coming. A purge, painful, but necessary. The forest fire that clears dead wood so new growth can begin. The rancher in Texas still didn't know. His world was about to change forever, but soon, very soon, everyone would know. There was a pattern emerging, a strange, disturbing pattern that most people missed entirely. Mark Zuckerberg, the tech billionaire, was building something unusual in Hawaii. Not another mansion, not another yacht, a bunker, an underground fortress with self-sustaining systems, food storage for years, water filtration, independent power generation. Why would one of the richest men in the world, a man who built his empire on connecting people digitally, suddenly be disconnecting himself physically? He wasn't alone. Across Silicon Valley, a quiet exodus was happening. Jeff Bezos buying vast ranches, Bill Gates accumulating farmland, hundreds of thousands of acres, tech executives purchasing remote properties in New Zealand, in Montana, in the wilderness. They were moving away from cities, away from the digital world they created, back to the physical. And the question nobody was asking was why. These were the smartest people in finance. They had access to information ordinary citizens never see. They attended meetings where real power gathered. They knew economists, central bankers, policymakers, and they were all doing the same thing, securing physical assets because they understood something fundamental. The digital economy was just a layer built on top of the physical economy. And when the money breaks, when the currency collapses, that digital layer evaporates. Your online bank balance means nothing. If the dollars backing it are worthless, your stock portfolio disappears. If the system measuring its value crashes, your crypto wallet becomes irrelevant. If nobody accepts the currency you're trying to exchange, the billionaires knew in a reset, Ownership of the physical world was the only thing that mattered. Land you can stand on, food you can eat, water you can drink, gold you can hold. Everything else was an illusion, and that illusion was about to shatter. Look at the stock market, the Dow Jones sitting at 40,000 points, financial media celebrating record highs, politicians bragging strongest economy ever. But there was a trick hidden in plain sight. Price it in gold. Suddenly the truth emerged. In gold terms, the stock market was crashing. You were getting more dollars, yes, but those dollars bought less house, less food, less energy, less everything. This was the money illusion, the greatest magic trick ever performed on humanity. You felt richer because the numbers went up, but you were actually getting poorer. The return of the gold standard stripped away this illusion. It forced everyone to confront reality, the reality of collective poverty. It was a harsh mirror, but it told the truth. And there was another dimension to this, a moral dimension that nobody discussed. Fiat money allowed governments to steal, not with guns, not with force, with inflation. They printed money to fund wars, wars the public never approved. They inflated the currency to pay for programs that benefited the connected, not the common. The poor watched their savings evaporate while the rich got bailouts. The worker saw wages stagnate while the banker got bonuses. It was a system of silent slavery, and gold was the key to breaking those chains because gold was honest. It couldn't be printed, couldn't be debased, couldn't be manipulated. A return to the gold standard was return to moral money. It rewarded savers and punished spenders. It aligned economic incentives with natural law. It restored sanity. But the timeline was accelerating faster than anyone predicted. What experts thought would take a decade was happening in months. The dollarization trend had gone vertical. The countries were dumping U.S. Treasury bonds at record pace. China selling billions, Japan reducing holdings, Saudi Arabia letting agreements expire. The Federal Reserve had lost control. They could print money, but they couldn't print confidence. And once confidence was lost, it never returned. The dollar had entered the graveyard of currencies, or the denarius, the signet, the mark already rested. So what should people do? The answer was both simple and terrifying. Get out of debt. Debt was a short position on currency. Good during inflation, maybe. But in a reset, the terms could change overnight. Own tangible assets, food, water, energy, gold, silver, things you could touch, use, trade, build skills valuable in a local economy, because the global supply chain was breaking down along with the currency that sustained it. You needed to survive without Amazon, without Walmart, without the system, and perhaps most importantly, prepare mentally because the psychological shock would be severe. Americans believed they were rich because they had high credit limits, big mortgages, car loans, lines of credit. But when the credit card stopped working, when the bank froze accounts, when the ATM dispensed worthless paper, they would realize they were poor. This cognitive dissonance would lead to social unrest, anger, confusion, violence as people realized they'd been robbed by their own leaders. The man in Hawaii building his bunker, he saw this coming. The billionaire buying farmland, he understood. The tech executive learning to hunt, he knew they weren't preparing for a recession. They were preparing for a reset, a complete, total systemic reset. And the question wasn't, would it happen? The question was, Mika, would you be ready when it did? Because ready or not, the king was returning to his throne, and he was bringing judgment. There was an old woman in Ohio, 73 years old. She had lived through recessions, through crashes, through the oil crisis of the 70s, through 2008's financial meltdown. She thought she had seen it all. But what was coming now was something she had never witnessed, something nobody alive had witnessed, the complete death of the world's reserve currency, and with it, the birth of something ancient, something that had existed for 5,000 years, sound money, the income tax, that deduction from every paycheck, that burden every worker carried. It only existed because of fiat currency. Think about it. In the 19th century, under the gold standard, there was no income tax in America, none. The government was small, funded by tariffs. It couldn't print money, so it couldn't grow endlessly. The return of the gold standard forced government to shrink. It starved the beast. If they couldn't print money, they couldn't afford a bloated bureaucracy. This transition might lead to something radical, the abolition of the IRS as we know it. A hard money system was a low-tax system. By necessity, by mathematics, by natural law, the woman in Ohio had paid taxes her entire life, watching half her income disappear to Washington. But in the new world coming, that might finally end. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something the Treasury Department wasn't discussing publicly. The U.S. government allegedly held over 8,000 tons of gold sitting in Fort Knox and other vaults currently valued on their books at $420 per ounce, $42 for an asset trading at thousands. It was absurd, but it was also strategic because in a reset, the Treasury could revalue this gold with a stroke of a pen from $40 to $20,000 per ounce instantly. Trillions of dollars of equity would appear on the government's balance sheet, allowing them to pay off debt, without default, without printing, without collapse. This stroke of the pen was the most likely mechanism for the reset. It would happen overnight. People would go to sleep in one world and wake up in another. Gold up 10,000%. Dollar down to its true value. Everything changed. But there was another player in this game, one that confused many people: Bitcoin. The crypto investors called it digital gold. They believed it would replace everything. But in a gold standard world, Bitcoin faced its toughest test. Would governments span it to protect their new gold-backed currencies? Or would Bitcoin serve as the high-speed rail for moving this new gold-backed value? The truth was probably somewhere in between. Bitcoin and gold would coexist as twin pillars of the new system. One analog, one digital, both enemies of the fiat dollar. Diversification into both was the ultimate hedge because when the currency revalued against gold, the cost of imported goods would skyrocket: electronics made in China, clothes manufactured overseas, coffee shipped from South America, all of it would become luxury items. This would trigger what the woman in Ohio feared most: social unrest. People would riot over the price of bread. The government would respond with price controls, with rationing, with force, and price controls always led to shortages. The gold standard brought long-term stability, yes, but the transition period was pure chaos. You needed to prepare for the streets, not just the markets. The too big to fail banks couldn't survive this. They were too leveraged, too exposed, too fraudulent. But from their ashes would rise something better. Small, local community banks, banks that actually held reserves, banks that knew their customers, banks that lent based on real collateral, not credit scores, not algorithms, not lies. The financial system would decentralize. The power of Wall Street would be broken and returned to Main Street. Imagine a debit card linked directly to your gold holdings. You swipe it at a coffee shop. It sells a milligram of gold to pay for your latte. This technology already existed. Kinesis, Glint, other platforms. In the new system, this would be the norm. You would spend gold instantly. The currency was just the transmission mechanism. The gold was the store of value, a post-fiat world where technology made using gold as easy as using Venmo. And then there was the peace dividend. Fiat money funded endless wars. Governments printed money to buy bombs without taxing citizens, without accountability. But under a gold standard, war was expensive. You had to pay in gold. Real gold, real cost, real consequences. This made long wars impossible. The return of sound money was the greatest force for peace. Nations would be forced to trade rather than invade. The death of the dollar might mean the birth of a more peaceful world. There was a biblical concept called Jubilee, a forgiveness of all debts. And as the fiat system collapsed, debts denominated in that currency became worthless. If the dollar went to zero, your mortgage in dollars effectively went to zero. The banks knew this. They would try to rewrite contracts to index debt to inflation to gold. But if you didn't sign, if you held firm, the inflation would wipe out your debt. It was the borrower's paradise and the lender's nightmare. Living under inflation caused anxiety. Always running on a treadmill, trying to keep up with rising prices. But sound money brought psychological peace. You knew your savings were safe. You knew your labor was stored in a battery that didn't leak. The return of the gold standard would heal the collective psyche of the nation. It restored the link between effort and reward. It brought back the dignity of work. The woman in Ohio sat in her kitchen looking at her savings account statement, wondering what it would all mean. Would she lose everything, or was this finally the correction the world needed? The gold standard wasn't just a monetary system, it was a civilization standard. It represented truth, honesty, and limits. The experiment of the last 50 years, the experiment of unlimited greed, of endless printing had failed. Nature was correcting the imbalance. The dollar was dead because it was a lie. Gold was alive because it was the truth. The king had returned, and as the sun set on the old world, it rose on a new one. A world where savers were rewarded, where workers kept the value they earned, where governments lived within their means, where wars were too expensive to wage, where honest money created honest societies. It would be painful. The transition would test everyone. But on the other side was something humanity hadn't seen in generations: freedom, real freedom, economic freedom, the freedom that comes from sound money. The woman in Ohio made her decision. She walked to her local coin shop and bought her first ounce of gold. It was heavy in her hand, real, tangible, true. And for the first time in years, she felt a hope. The king had returned. Long live the king, and long live those wise enough to stand in his court when he distributed the wealth. The new world was here. The question was, were you ready for it? This is the reality we're facing, my friends. The gold standard has returned, and whether you believe it or fight it won't change. What's coming? The only question is preparation. If you found this valuable, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Boring Economy, because boring just became the most interesting thing in your financial future. Tell me in the comments, are you prepared? Do you own gold, or are you still holding paper? I'll see you in the next one. Stay wise, stay prepared, and remember, in the end, truth always wins.